This is Paul Leon from Leon Solutions, and you're listening to the Persistence Mastery Podcast, the show that elevates communication skills for people who love conquering their career. Today's episode is going to be on objections. What are objections? Well, if you read any good sales content or you've been in sales for a long time, then you understand objections. You understand it from a frame of maybe it's an excuse to you sometimes, or maybe it's somebody not willing to meet you halfway. Let me be clear with you on what objections are. I've mentioned this book before on this podcast trainings I've done around the country. There's a book out there called Spin Selling. And I love this book a lot. It's one of my favorites, even though it was written in the late 80s, early 90s. It's still referenced to this day by a lot of published authors, and it's used as a strong framework. And I was actually on the phone with the company that developed the research behind spin selling out of the UK this week. Spoke to a very nice woman. She was very professional, very respectful, and really just trying to connect with her on spin selling, trying to bring the methodology of open ended questions more into this world. And after that conversation, the thing I had shared with her that I loved most about this book was I loved the way that they explained what an objection is. An objection is a lack of commitment. That's all it is. And here's the thing when it comes to objections. And if you're a sales professional out there listening to this, perk up your ear, stay with me, because it's going to change and reframe probably how you see objections. Many people I've worked with who work in sales typically have a negative connotation to objections. They'll share with me, it's an excuse, Paul. That's just an excuse. Or I'll hear from somebody else when I make a phone call and they'll be like, this guy had a lot of questions and it irritated me. So I burned him and hung up the phone. I don't recommend you hang up the phone on your customers. And I don't recommend that you reframe your thinking of them as an excuse. What an objection is, it's a lack of a commitment. That's all it is. It's saying the customer is not committed to your product or service. That's all it is. And the best way that we can handle objections in our consultations and we work with other people is through the skill of questions. And the reason I referenced that book, Spin Selling, so heavily is because it was studied by Neil Rackham, who went on over with a clipboard thousands. In fact, to be more accurate, somewhere between the range of 30 to 35,000 consultations across the top sales professionals in the world. He doesn't consider himself a sales professional. He considers himself a research professional. But this book is still highly coveted and used to this day by other sales trainers, sales professionals, because what it did for the industry was it reframed the idea around closing sales. Because a lot of us out there are still falling into the trap of we have to be handling objections. We have to use specialized techniques or manipulation to convert our customers into the sale and power close them. You know, when I got into sales, one of the ways I was taught how to handle one objection around someone not having their spouse or partner next to them was to say something along the lines of this: Mr. Customer, if your partner was sitting there holding your hand and she looked at you and said, it's okay for you to buy this. I care about you. I want you to have this. Would you be ready to buy today? And believe it or not, maybe you have or have not met me personally. I'm a pretty dramatic person at times, and I can be pretty theatrical and pretty animated. And sometimes people would buy. People would buy when I would be that dramatic or theatrical, and maybe I made them laugh. Maybe because I was persistent. I don't know. But a lot of people didn't. A lot of people got very turned off because they could see that technique in advance. In fact, one time when I used that technique on one partner being there without the other, later that night, that partner came back with their spouse and they canceled the service I was selling at the time because they weren't there in the first place. So I mentioned that to you as an experience to really hone in on this idea of an objection is just a lack of commitment. And the way to handle it is through a certain type of questioning framework to guide the customer to sell themselves into the sale. Going back to the book now, Spin Selling. What that book revealed was that the top professionals didn't do objection handling, they did objection prevention by building perceived value. Let me say that again because I think it's really powerful. They never did objection handling, they did objection prevention by focusing on building perceived value. And the best way you can do that is to know how to ask effective questions that encourage the customer to conversate more with you. And the reason that's critical for you is because the more that they conversate and talk, the more commitments they'll organically create as they communicate with you. And what those 35,000 consultations studied was the salespeople who encouraged the customer to talk, encouraged them to even conversate more, actually closed at higher rates and even had an easier time asking for the sale because they did a lot of the a lot of the customer communicating in the beginning, not the salesperson. See, the two biggest complaints across most industries is this. Number one, they felt the salesperson didn't listen to them. And number two, the salesperson did not communicate effectively with them. So the two biggest complaints I see across rental car, generators, memberships, insurance, real estate, I see it time and time again. The same complaint across all these different industries, which tells me this: we've lost the ability, or we're losing the ability, to encourage more questions and conversation from the customer earlier and allowing it to happen. What do I mean by allowing it to happen? One of the things that was really interesting in my research before this podcast was I went down this path of even studying other professors and other trainers who teach similar content and values that I teach around human behavior. One trainer actually combines his disc training with open question ended question training. It was a very enlightening session for me. And even as myself has been public speaking for over 15 years now, I love that I can always learn something new. But going back to the trainer I was watching, he said something that really resonated with me. Now, if you've ever studied any type of human behavior training, whether it's Myers-Briggs, DISC, etc., typically the one thing that all those personality human behavior models have in common is they will show a dominant behavior style. In DISC, it's direct. We'll just go with that example. And a dominant behavior style is typically somebody who wants results, etc., whatnot. And this is typically a person who is entrepreneurial. And this person who typically is entrepreneurial will start their own business and then they'll attempt to do selling and they'll struggle really hard and they'll give up because they don't know why people aren't listening to them and they get frustrated. Why aren't people buying my solution, product, or service? I don't understand. And one of the things this trainer said that was really interesting, he said, if you're a direct behavior style, the reason you may be struggling in sales most of the time is because you go to the solution too quickly and you don't allow the customer to talk more in the beginning. And I sat there and I was like, whoa, I've been certified for over a decade now. I've got my degree in organizational behavior. Why did I not ever think of that? It seems like common sense. Yet common sense is not always common. And it started me down a bigger path of where I said, why have I not expanded around open ended questions? Why have I not done this more in my career as a trainer? I'm going to tell you why. It's because I was getting into a place where I was complacent. And that's hard to admit, complacency. I don't like admitting that But one of the ways you can disrupt complacency or being too comfortable is through new educational pathways. And I remembered that I used to do this more effectively when I was on the front lines. I would have a clipboard and I had what I called an assessment sheet. And at the top of the assessment sheet, I had several open ended questions that I saw that worked. And I didn't know this. I wasn't reading as much as I should have been during this earlier time in my career, which I'm guilty of doing. But when I think about now and I think about 15 years ago, if I had asked more effective open ended questions when there was objections, when the customer brought up interests within the consultation, I would have even had higher closing rates than I did. And that's my hope for you. So here's a couple things I really want you to take to heart as you listen to this episode around objections. I want you to allow your customers, number one, encourage conversation through open ended questions. How do you do that? I want you to pick up the book Spin Selling. Even though it was written in 1989 and it's dated, it's still relevant to this day because it's sourced at HubSpot.com. Many different educational resources around sales still reference that book as the Mecca reference point for how to properly do consultative sales skills, not transactional, because that's different, but consultative sales skills within their business. And when you apply that book and you apply the framework of, okay, I need to create open ended questions to build perceived value. Now you're not going to just be somebody who's trying to manipulate or handle someone or I'm going to power close this person. No, you're going to build perceived value and relational skills more effectively. See, let's say you sell a product that has different color options and the customer goes, I really like that color. And you go, great. And you keep going and giving information. Well, that right there is another example of how you could have said, why is that color important to you, if I may ask? And the customer will share with you. And I will tell you this, my goal over this year into next year, as being a quality trainer or making myself better, is to disrupt my complacency through not only teaching the skill of open ended questions, but reading more up on it. That's my commitment I've made to myself. I'm going to read, I'm going to listen, I'm going to associate with others who have that skill. And this is a skill and it takes time. And I would encourage you that once you have your framework of quality open ended questions down, post reading Spin Selling or listening to the book Spin Selling, apply it through the next 13 consultations. Just through 13 consultations and track your sales out of 13 consultations. And more importantly, I think when you really start to see the beauty of doing this skill is when people will start talking and you start allowing them to commit themselves. And the reason that's important is what the book also speaks to is that the more commitments we get in the beginning through the sales process, the easier time we have closing the sale when we ask for it. Let me say that again. The more commitments we get from the customer early through the sales process, the easier time we have in getting to the point of where we ask for the sale. Because just like an objection is a lack of commitment, closing the sale is a final commitment from the customer to say yes. But if we go too quickly with our solution, we go too quickly with, hey, here's your problem. Now, here's my solution. You want to buy it? And we don't, as some people say, peel that onion or really uncover those future problems, not just current problems. We're going to have more customers say no versus more customers that say yes. Thank you for listening to the Persistence Mastery Podcast. See you on the next one.